Hello and welcome to our fourth CAHRS webcast of 2019. My name is Brad Bell. I am the director of CAHRS as well as a professor here in the HR Studies Department in ILR School. I'm joined today by my colleague Chris Collins. Chris is a former director of CAHRS and also serves as our director of graduate studies here in ILR School. Chris has been doing some work around HR transformation with our CAHRS partners over the past several years, so we thought this would be a great opportunity to get together, share some of the insights that have come out of Chris's work to date, as well as to answer some of the burning questions that you might have. So just to give you an idea of our plan for the next 30 minutes or so, we'll spend the first 15 minutes moving pretty quickly through some background. I'll ask Chris some questions about the work that he's been doing, kind of talk through some of his insights. We'll reserve the last 15 minutes or even more if there's a lot of questions to answer those questions that you have. So I would encourage you, as questions come to mind, please submit them. We might take some as we're going along, and we'll certainly reserve, again, a big chunk at the end of today's session to address all of your questions. So Chris, it seems like, as we talk to companies, virtually all companies today are talking about or going through HR transformation. Some maybe seem like they're farther along than others, different stages of the process, but everybody seems to be kind of focused on it. So based on your work, what have you found maybe are some of the key factors that are driving this focus?
Yeah, it's funny. So sitting in my office this morning just thinking about this topic, and I'm not as young as I used to be, right? I'll admit to that. I think HR has been transforming itself for the 30 years I've been around the function. I think what's different now is the big things that I think we're facing as a function. One is just how fast the business environment that these companies are working in are changing. So it's the rapid speed of change makes it really hard for HR to keep up in terms of how's it impacting the business, how's it really helping to transform itself to add more value. I think part of the issue is just how much has been trimmed out of the HR budget over the last 10 or 15 years, right? So one way a lot of companies try to create more value through HR is to actually spend less on it, right? So that was a way to give back to, the shareholder, to the owners. But I think that hurts us now in terms of being able to do new things in new ways. I think part of it is the silos that exist inside the function of HR, right? So that silos could be between what are HR business partners doing, how well do they work with COEs, how well do the two of them work with shared services. I think there's also silos between different business units or different regions, which makes transfer of knowledge, application of consistent practices difficult. I think the other key challenge, and this has really come out over the last 3 years, it is just how HR has been set up, right? So we're kind of stuck in our own mental model of what HR is, and it's hard for us often to get out of that. So in the last meeting we did in Amsterdam on this topic, someone asked the question, would HR look different if we were designing it today versus redesigning it off of what we've done in the past? So I think that's a complication we face, is that we're kind of stuck in our own mental model of what HR looks like and does. And I think that makes it harder for us to continue to transform faster.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, given all these changes, these challenges, that these would have implications for not only the structure of HR and how we think about structure, but also the competencies and capabilities of HR professionals today. So as you talk to companies, what are they kind of thinking about in terms of what their HR leaders need to look like in this future model?
Yeah, I think across the board, in the meetings we've had, lots of different things have come up. And I'd also push the folks watching today to also look at the CAHRS website, because you've done some great work on this as well as part of the CAHRS board work on what are the competencies of the function going forward. But the things I've been hearing pretty consistently is this idea of business acumen is less about finance and much more about understanding the changing business models of how companies win and succeed in whatever business environment that they're in, right? Those are changing so quickly because of technology. How do we reach consumers or reach customers? How do we create value for them? So really keeping current on what are those business models for how we're successful. I think finding HR folks that are more agile, right, that can more quickly move on things and adapt and change, both personally but also in the design of the HR things that they create. I think this ability to work across groups, so really thinking about how do I bring in viewpoints, not just of other parts of HR, but really bring in viewpoints of the end user, or bring in viewpoints of folks from marketing, folks from the IT function. So how do we work better across the organization, which I think takes a particular skill. I think there's this digital savviness that we're looking for more and more from HR folks, is not to be afraid of technology, but to think about what is technology enabling us to do. How can we think about using technology better to deliver solutions? I think this idea of being innovative and creative as well, right? So breaking out of the mold of how we've done things in the past, whether that's learning, staffing, training, diversity and inclusion, pay. I think we have to start to blow up some of the old models of how we did things in HR, because they're just too slow, right? And they don't respond fast enough. So, so those are some of the ones that probably come to mind most readily for me in terms of competencies.
So one of the ones I saw in your recent write-up from the working group you just did in Amsterdam was around kind of this awareness of macro trends and changes. And I thought that one was really interesting, because I think HR maybe sometimes kind of focuses internally, focuses on itself, or at least within its own organization, but it's suggesting that HR professionals need to be kind of looking externally a lot more.
Yeah, so I think that, and that was an interesting one to me too, is that it's the macro trends around work, right? So what's changing in the world of work? It's the macro trends around what's changing in the world, right? Which has huge impact on what do employees expect, what of our managers and leaders expect from HR. It also has to do with what's changing outside of HR. So what's changing in terms of the digital world in general, what's changing in terms of globalization or non-globalization, what's changing in terms of laws that impact the business and how the business is going to provide. So if we stick to just what's changing about HR, I think we get lost in the weeds again of HR versus how much we tracking what's happening in the world and letting that help us inform decisions on where we want to move HR practices.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you kind of what maybe companies are doing differently to address some of these challenges. But I think, based on all the changes that you've been talking about, kind of raises a question for me is, are there parts of HR that are working well and that we want to make sure we kind of carry over into this? Because I think the risk is that we kind of blow up everything, right, at the same time. Maybe in some cases that's needed.
So what I think is interesting is every company that we've talked to, they're all doing some things really well, right? So maybe that's because they've advanced those aspects of HR the fastest at their company, because of their particular industry or their particular culture or their particular business model. So I don't think this is about blowing up all of HR, right? I do think there's some things we have to do in a very consistent way, like how we think about pay and the fairness behind pay, the ability for pay to motivate. Those things are humans are humans. I don't think we've changed that much. I think humans have evolved tremendously in the last 40 years to be different from how we thought about pay in the past. But I do think it's the rethinking delivery models of some of these things. So I think the concepts behind learning haven't changed. I don't think the concepts and theory behind selection have changed, but how we can do it has changed a lot. So that's where I think the innovation around what we know about how to do those things and how to do it faster, better, quicker is where the innovation comes in.
Great. So I'm going to ask Chris maybe one more question, and then we'll get to your questions. I see at least one or two coming in so far. So I'd certainly encourage you, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them, because we'll get to those very quickly here. So my last question is really around, given these challenges, what have you seen across the companies that you've talked to in terms of, what they've found is maybe working and helping kind of guide them through this transformation?
Yeah, so when I think of transformation, I would define it as how are we changing HR to drive more value to the business, right? And so if that's how we think of HR transformation, I think the first one goes back to, are we really looking at what the business is trying to do now and what the business is doing or going to be doing in the next 3 to 5 years? And are we designing HR solutions around that? I see a lot where companies are redesigning HR for who we are today, but we know in 3 years it's going to be vastly different, right? So I'm really trying to push and talk to companies around how are you thinking about where the company is going and how do you redesign the delivery of HR to meet the future strategy of the company versus the current? Because the current, in this environment isn't going to last that long. The best thing I heard in Amsterdam, or the most insightful to me, was a CHRO that was with us who basically said, look, for 30 years of his career, as HR has been transforming itself, it's always been about how do we do more with less. And he said the final epiphany that he had that's changed his thinking is the real question is how do we do less with less, right? Because you can't keep spreading the jar of peanut butter across more sandwiches. So how do you really think about figuring out what things of HR are you going to invest in, where are you going to have strengths, and what things are you going to outsource, stop doing, so that you can really focus the effort, resources, talent around those things of HR you think make the most difference for your company. I think tied to that then is this real focus and kind of deeper thinking on how do we really impact the employee experience. What for our company, for our groups of employees in our industry, what are those moments that matter the most, and how are we going to be excellent at those things and maybe just okay or even not okay at some of those other things that are less important to them. And then I think it's really this, all the new tools, reapplication of tools that we've had for a long time. So design thinking, which to me is somewhat of an evolution of process consulting. How do we use those tools to really think about the end user, the experience of that user to redesign things better? How do we include their voice, which helps us do things faster and better? How do we use agile thinking to try and rethink parts of HR? How do we use technology for better delivery, right? So there's lots of tools we can use to help do these things. But I think it starts with those first three. Do we really know where the business is going? Do we know what makes the most sense to invest in, because that's where we're going to have the greatest leverage in HR? And is that really built around building the employee experience for those employees that are key to that future?
Mm-hmm. So I also thought in reading your summary that doing less with less and really kind of targeting those investments was interesting, because we've heard so much about doing more with less for decades now. So I mean, as you talk to companies or heard from the companies around that, I mean, were there certain areas that they said these should really remain kind of core, particularly in this changing world that we're living in? I'm thinking of something like learning, right? Yeah. It seems like a core area that a lot of companies are looking at, but other areas.
Yeah, because actually for their company, the number one focus was around leaders, right? So how are they going to build out great leaders in the organization who can then deliver better coaching, better career advice, better thinking inside the organization that's going to drive better results? And they were to the point of thinking about how do you outsource almost all of learning. And partly that was their conclusion that for much of the skills, capabilities in their company, it's not firm-specific skills, right? So why not use some of these larger internet education firms, let them do it, let them be the ones that are updating programming, design thinking classes, whatever that our leaders need, instead of us controlling that themselves. Others were very much the other way, right? That they do have firm-specific knowledge that really drives competitive advantage for them. So how do they focus on continue to enhance that aspect of learning that's really pushing internal capabilities? So how do we engage more of our own thought leaders inside the company to become educators? Do we create our own internal YouTube learning sites, right? So I think it differed across companies as to where that focus was, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some questions coming in, so why don't we dive into these? So the first question, essentially is asking, a lot of times in HR we kind of try to balance these focus on kind of cost as well as differentiation, and sometimes we don't end up doing either of them extremely well. And so kind of, where should we sit on this continuum between, kind of execution and costs and kind of really differentiation and value, and how do we maybe balance those competing demands?
Yeah. I will say this is my own personal opinion. I don't know if anyone out there is going to back me up on this, but I think one of the worst things we did in HR was really trying to define ourselves based on the cost footprint of the function rather than the value that we do and the way we create value for the company, right? So I think if we can get back to saying, here are the things we've invested in, here's how that's led to better leaders, here's how that's led to attracting better talent, here's how that's led to retention, here's how that's led to greater diversity, and then be able to connect those back to how did that impact new customers, how did that impact new innovations and new products, entry to new markets, right? So I think if we're always going back to the cost play, we're always in big trouble, because finance will always look at HR as a cost center where we can continue to trim the budget. So if we don't change the discussion about here's how we are creating value, And I think that's this notion of also doing less with less, right? So what are the things that we have been doing that we don't have that story for? Are those things that we should give up? Are those things that we don't want to invest in as much? And is that where we can trim some cost to do it by outsourcing it to an online platform that someone else controls or whatever that might be? So I think we're going to still do both, but I think I would push my energy towards focusing on, can I really create a better story of how we're impacting the value versus here's how I'm saving incrementally a little bit more money this year.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So the next question is around, how is the HRBP role evolving, in this, new model? And I know we've done some work within CAHRS on this, in the last few years.
I do think, to me, the best part of being an HR business partner today, compared to when I, first thought about the HR generalist role 30 years ago, is really that a lot of the work that I would have hated to do has gone away, right? So the paperwork, the benefits enrollment, all that, and it's really left that job to focus more on, do I really have a clear picture of what the business is trying to do? Can I then translate that back to the COEs and shared services to make sure we've got the right support infrastructure? So that partnering on both sides and really being a consultant on what are the underlying people challenges that are going to be tied to where the business is going? Do we have the right infrastructure to support the bringing in of talent, the retraining of talent, the right diversity of talent on the team? I think the more and more that focus around coaching leaders and helping them become better leaders rather than just managers. I think that ability to have difficult conversations around, is this the right thing for the business? Does this fit with our culture? Are we really happy with the way we're doing things here? Is this the right thing for our people? I think those aspects of the job are going to continue to get enhanced as more and more of what used to be the day-to-day job of generalists becomes either automated with AI, goes to shared service centers, and so on.
So this question, kind of gets at, I think, what we were just talking about a little while ago, but doing less with less, how can HR deliver the highest value? And I think, what I heard you say was it's really going to depend on the company and where they should be focusing those investments. But another piece that I think is interesting here is then how do we measure it, right? I mean, what is the role of kind of analytics? And you're talking about that just, in demonstrating our value, right? I mean, any thoughts or tips there?
So, and again, this has been, I think the first working group we did on HR analytics was probably about 11 years ago now. And companies at that stage barely had HR data. Many of you have migrated to platforms, technologies where you've integrated all the HR data across the company, whoever that provider might be, and I won't name names. So you've all struggled through that part of your transition. So now the point is, connecting HR data to HR data is not very useful. So I think if we're going to demonstrate the value, it's saying, okay, we reduced turnover by X. Here's how that led to better productivity in the plant. Here's how that led to cost savings for the company and the bottom line revenue. If it's about the sales team, here's the changes we made. Here's the impact it had on the sales force. How did that connect to new sales, new customers, more return cut, right? So we've got to connect this back, if we're going to prove the value story, back to business data, right? Which is bottom line profitability, top line sales, growth in new markets, new innovations that have been introduced, right? It's those numbers that the CEO and his or her team are looking at when they're going to talk to the board, investors, the street about how their company's performing. And that's where I think we've gotten stuck on only connecting it back to HR stuff, which has no value story at the end of the day of the organization. So we've got to make that next leap.
Makes sense. So this one's, I think, more of a statement than a question, but it kind of goes to our discussion around learning. Basically they say, it seems to me less about outsourcing your learning, but kind of thinking about what do you kind of procure inside versus kind of go to the outside for. And I think it's essentially what you're saying, right? In those areas where maybe the content is more firm generic and you could just buy it off the shelf and it's going to work well in your organization, that's the most efficient path. And target your investments in those areas internally that are really firm specific and core to the value.
Yeah, or potentially they're, so firm specific versus generic is one way. How stable is that going to be, right? So if this is something people inside the company are going to be learning and need to learn for the next 10 years, then probably building it yourself is in the end more efficient than outsourcing it. But if this is a skill that's changing every year, 2 years, By the time we build it, half a year has gone by, and then it's relevant for another 6 months or 9. Just find it outside, right? So I think there's lots of dimensions on what makes more sense. How much capability do we have internally? How expensive is that? How much return do we get from buying it, that talent internally and owning it versus renting it from someone? So I think all those questions have to come into play.
Mm-hmm. So this question kind of gets at, how are companies enabling leaders to drive many of these talent management or HR practices themselves so as to free up, HR team members to be more strategic, maybe with less?
Yeah. Part of the magic dust of the HR transformation, right, is if we're going to make managers be leaders, we have to help them become leaders, right? So, this is an ongoing issue. And I make up numbers when it comes to leadership all the time. So, my best guess, and again, there's no data I have on this, 10% of managers are leaders, right? The rest are managers, right? They're tacticians, they're good at the technical aspect of their job, but they couldn't lead if their life depended on it, right? So asking them to have conversations with employees around their careers, asking them to give real feedback around how they're doing in their job, helping them think through what are the learning opportunities that could help them grow towards their career aspirations, they're not good at because they never learned how to do it. They never had a leader that showed them through their own behavioral modeling, right? So I think companies have to think about how do we help managers become leaders, right? So how do we connect them with role models and mentors? How do we do more training by doing, right? So that there's action learning that they're going through, role playing. So you can think about how do you have these conversations? What are different approaches? Can I hear my voice within these different models of how to have these conversations so I can figure out how I do that? So I just don't think we've done enough of that. We've given leaders more responsibility. I'm not sure we've given them the mental tools of how to do it. We just expect them to become leaders, right? So I do think investing in them to have those conversations, to hire people who are more inclined to want to do those conversations, I think all those things are important for this HR transformation to work. Otherwise, we're going to do less and less and less and just going to diminish the employee experience. Mm-hmm.
So this question basically gets at, based on the research, have we seen any salient differences in how size of company kind of impacts the HR model? For example, our shared service centers, more broadly found in large companies with scale, outsourcing found in smaller companies. I know in your write-up you had this point around, as companies do these transformations, complexity matters, right? I mean, complexity matters in terms of scale. It matters in terms of how differentiated different geographies or business units are. So it does seem like there's a complexity issue here.
There's a huge complexity issue potentially, right? So if I'm in a relatively large business where I deliver value the exact same way to the end customer, the same everywhere, that's simple, right? To create lots of scale around what do leaders look like, what do key employees look like, how do I train for that job, right? So if I think of a company like Starbucks, where you're basically delivering the same store model globally, or maybe small nuances here and there, but that how do you train a barista, how do you train a store lead, those things you could scale massively, right? If I've got 30 different business units that each have different customers, I have different go-to-market strategies, that's where scaling becomes really complex because the solution for a branch bank may be very different from a small consumer lending bank, which may be different from the large investment bank, which may be different from a different part, right? So each of those has different types of employees doing different things for different customers. Scaling becomes much more difficult at that level. But I also think scale matters, right? So if I've got 300,000 employees, I've got a budget that I can do things that's very different than if I've got 5,000 employees, right? So, scale has huge implications for all this. I think where it gets really complex is if I'm really large and have lots of different strategies and different regions that have different needs, you can't just have that one size fits all for all of them.
Mm-hmm. So this question, kind of gets at a point I think you made several times around coordination across the different pillars of HR, HRBP, COE, shared services. Often we end up with these silos. We end up with problems in terms of things being handed off from one to another, just coordination. Have you seen strategies that companies have adopted to kind of get better coordination across these different units?
Yeah, so the best examples I've heard tend to have two things in common. One, those three pillars or those three legs of the HR stool, however you want to think of it, work much better when there's a shared common purpose, mission, strategy, right? So if one of the best I've heard is, we're going to become really focused on developing skills in our employees, right? And so the HR business partners get really clear on how they figure out what are the skills important for their business, how do they translate that back to the COAs to design larger scale training or learning opportunities. How does that get pushed into the shared services where they can think about how do we push better information to employees around what careers are important, what new jobs are going to come open, right? So when they have that common purpose, they work better together. I think you can also get them to work better together when there's solutions designed with cross-unit teams, right? So you've got some HRBPs working with COE people, working with shared services, so you get all three perspectives working together simultaneously in the creation of a solution. Then you actually get all three thinking about where do they add value, where do they have the best leverage to drive this solution.
Mm-hmm. One strategy I know some companies have adopted also is, kind of rotating people through those different areas. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really tough question now, particularly because what we're asking for from leaner COEs is really deep expertise, right? So I think there's an inherent risk of moving a HR business partner into a COE leadership role for only a year or two, then to move them back out, because what you've done is you've extracted someone who had the deep expertise that could actually design better solutions. So yes, I think earlier in the career, much better than later in the career. Mm-hmm. I think by the time you get to the senior most levels, you want people to develop that deep expertise, whether that's a business partner who knows really how do you go in and do coaching, how do you do it, go in and be the consultant and really understand how the business is changing and what are the talent implications, or the shared service person who really knows how to do these things at scale and consistency. So I would say at the top levels, I don't think the movement is the right thing. Personally, I don't. I think that movement needs to happen earlier, and so they get the appreciation for those different ways of doing HR. But at the top, I think you want the deep expert in those roles.
Yeah, makes sense. So this question asks about location strategy and how companies might be doing more things remotely that maybe used to have to sit close to clients. In particular, they ask about HRBP roles, for example. I mean, it seems like we're seeing more remote work in general. Seems like it's maybe a better fit for some of the COE areas, but when you really need that business partner, are you seeing any companies adopt a more kind of virtual model for that?
It's actually a question I haven't asked. I mean, it makes a lot of sense if the employee base is virtual, right? So having a HR business partner with a defined location that's supporting a team that's globally dispersed probably doesn't make any sense. I do think then you have to think about what are the ways that they connect with people more consistently to hear the voice of the employee on the ground, to really be able to coach and give advice to employees, to leaders, right? So I think you've got to have a strong set of relationships to do that aspect of your job. But if you're all remote anyways, so then it probably doesn't make sense. But when there's a defined location where most of the employees are, I think that'd be hard to do remotely because you just don't have the time to have those, spontaneous meetings, conversations. So, I'd be torn on that one.
Yeah. This one's a little similar, essentially asking, in global organizations where maybe you have very centralized COEs or shared services, how do they manage kind of local requirements, different, language, skills, knowledge, across different, geographies? And it seems like in some organizations we're seeing these kind of federated models trying to balance this, centralization with having people sitting out maybe in some of those localities.
Yeah, I think this is where, how different is it by region versus how different is it by business unit, right? So, I could see where maybe we've got one business unit where the delivery of what we have to the end customer is the same across regions. I think that could be more centralized in many ways because there's consistency in what we're doing. Other times, the individual markets are so different that you'd want the agility to be there. So again, it depends. I do think this idea of knowing what each of those regions' needs are or business unit needs are and translating the solutions to fit those is important, whether that's by language, by strategy. So, I think the one size fits all we know doesn't work for most companies because we don't have a one size fits all business. So
this is an interesting one. It actually came up in a working group I recently did around talent strategy. The question is, how do we see COEs evolving in the future? And at this meeting, one of the interesting things I thought they brought up, kind of back to your point, if we could reconceptualize all of this, would it still look the same way? They're saying, should we, for example, get rid of learning, staffing, et cetera, and organize it around leadership, organize it around the employee experience, right? So structurally thinking about the outcomes instead of maybe the functional, delivery areas. But do you see any other kind of maybe changes coming along the way? And they specifically ask about merging maybe between COE and HRBP type roles.
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I do think we're going to continue to evolve. I mean, I don't. I think in many ways that the creation of expertise in areas is super important, right? So, I don't want to go back to the days when HRBPs have to be the expert in org design, learning, staffing, compensation, and still have them also coaching, being part of the strategy and decision making. It's just too much, right? So I think at some point we need those people, those deep expertise. We have seen more companies move towards the pulling of COEs together into things like consolidated talent management, or maybe it's a bigger learning and growth fund, right? So I think where it makes sense to combine them, so you get leverage across the individual pillars within the COEs, I think is really good.
Like you were saying earlier, maybe through project teams, task forces that also bring people together from different areas to deliver on a particular outcome or project, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks, Chris, so much for your insight. Thank you for all of you that joined us today, and thanks for all your great questions. Before we wrap up, I just want to highlight a few things. One, we'll be sending out a link to this recorded version of this webcast today, so if you want to review anything, or certainly we hope that you share it with your colleagues that might also find it of interest. Also want to highlight that we have some upcoming CAHRS events. We kind of take a lighter schedule typically over the summer, but we'll be ramping up again come September and October with a number of different working groups, as well as our fall partner meeting that we'll be holding here on campus in Ithaca, October 23rd and 24th. Details about all these events can be found on our website, so certainly encourage you to constantly check back in there so that you can see what we have upcoming. So thank you again for your participation, and thanks again, Chris.
Yeah, my pleasure.